The autumn morning air carried the scent of freshly fallen leaves and the distant hum of school buses as Amara Johnson adjusted her worn leather messenger bag and stepped through the imposing oak doors of Westfield Preparatory Academy. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, and the walls displayed portraits of distinguished alumni, faces that all seemed to share the same privileged background, the same confident smirk, the same pale complexion that stood in stark contrast to her own rich brown skin. Amara's heart hammered against her ribcage as she navigated the bustling hallway filled with students who moved with a casual confidence that only came from belonging somewhere completely. Their designer uniforms fit perfectly, their conversations peppered with references to summer homes in the Hamptons and skiing trips to Aspen. She clutched her scholarship acceptance letter in her pocket like a talisman, a reminder that she had earned her place here through sheer academic excellence, not family connections or inherited wealth. Ready for the complete story? Smash that subscribe button and tell me where you're tuning in from in the comments. Tomorrow brings another mind-blowing story that's just as unbelievable. Trust me, you'll want to be here for it. Alright, let's jump into it. Excuse me, are you lost? A sharp voice cut through her thoughts. Amara turned to see a tall, imposing man with silver hair and cold gray eyes standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a classroom. His navy blazer bore the school's crest, and his posture radiated the kind of authority that came from years of never being questioned. Students aren't supposed to be wandering the halls during class periods. I'm not lost, sir, Amara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I'm Amara Johnson. I'm starting today as a senior, and I'm looking for advanced placement literature with Professor Blackwood, he interrupted, his eyes narrowing as they traveled from her second-hand blazer to her carefully polished but clearly old shoes. Professor Blackwood. And you're looking at him. He paused, letting his gaze linger on her face with an expression that made her skin crawl. So you're the scholarship student I've heard so much about. The one who supposedly has such exceptional potential. The way he said the word supposedly made Amara's stomach twist, but she held her ground. Yes, sir. I'm honored to be here. Honored. He repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. How refreshing. Well, Miss Johnson, I hope you understand that at Westfield Preparatory, we maintain the highest academic standards. Standards that have remained unchanged for over a century. His smile was cold, calculating. I do hope you'll be able to keep up. As Amara followed him into the classroom, she noticed how the conversations died down and 20 pairs of eyes turned to assess her. Some looked curious, others dismissive, but all carried the same underlying message: you don't belong here. She found an empty seat in the back row, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out her notebook and pen. Professor Blackwood positioned himself at the front of the room like a general surveying his troops. Class, we have a new addition today. Miss Johnson has joined us from. He paused, consulting a file on his desk with theatrical precision. Lincoln High School. I'm sure she'll find our curriculum quite challenging compared to what she's used to. Amara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with teachers like this before, educators who saw her zip code and immediately assumed her intellectual capacity. But she had also proven them wrong, every single time. Today we're discussing the thematic complexities of Shakespeare's Othello, Professor Blackwood continued, his eyes never leaving Amara's face. A play that explores themes of jealousy, manipulation, and the dangers of allowing outsiders into established social structures. The emphasis on outsiders wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Miss Johnson, since you're new, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on Iago's motivations? Surely Lincoln High covered this particular play. The question hung in the air like a trap, and Amara could feel the entire class waiting for her response. She knew this moment would define her entire experience at Westfield Preparatory. She could shrink back, make excuses, and confirm everyone's worst assumptions about her. Or she could show them exactly what they were dealing with. Amara stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Actually, Professor Blackwood, I think Iago's motivations are far more complex than simple jealousy or racism, though both elements certainly play a role. Her voice grew stronger with each word. He represents the danger of intellectual pride corrupted by resentment, a man who believes his superior understanding of human nature gives him the right to manipulate others like chess pieces. The classroom fell silent. Professor Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. "Interesting interpretation," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "But I'm afraid you're oversimplifying." "Am I?" Amara interrupted, her scholarly passion overriding her nervousness. "Because if we look at Act 1, Scene 3, when Iago says, 'I know my price, I am worth no worse a place,' he's not just expressing jealousy about Cassio's promotion. He's revealing his fundamental belief that merit should be recognized regardless of social connections. The tragedy is that he's actually right about the corruption in the system, but his response to it becomes monstrous." A few students exchanged glances, and Amara noticed one boy in the front row, tall, with kind brown eyes and an expression of genuine interest, leaning forward in his seat. Professor Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Johnson, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I think you'll find that your previous educational experience may not have prepared you for the level of analysis we expect here at Westfield." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now, and Amara felt something ignite in her chest. She had faced this same dismissive attitude from teachers who assumed that her background automatically limited her intellectual capacity. But she had spent years proving them wrong, and she wasn't about to stop now. "With respect, Professor," she said, her voice carrying a new edge, "I think you'll find that intellectual curiosity and academic rigor aren't limited by zip code or family income." The tension in the room was palpable. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Professor Blackwood's face had gone rigid, his gray eyes flashing with something that looked dangerously close to fury. But what happened next would change everything, not just for Amara, but for everyone in that perfectly ordered classroom where privilege and prejudice had just met their match. The silence that followed Amara's bold statement stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Professor Blackwood's face had transformed from condescending amusement to something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that seemed to fill the ornate classroom like frost creeping across a window. But before he could respond, the bell rang, its sharp chime cutting through the tension like a blade. "Class dismissed," Professor Blackwood announced, his voice deceptively calm. "Miss Johnson, please remain behind. We need to discuss your adjustment to Westfield's academic expectations." As students filed out, casting curious glances over their shoulders, Amara felt her heart sink. She had won the battle but potentially lost the war. The boy from the front row, the one who had been leaning forward with interest, lingered by the door, his expression troubled. "Miss Johnson," he called softly, "I'm Gabriel Richardson." That was impressive. His voice carried a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place, and his dark eyes held genuine warmth. "If you need anything at all, you can find me in the library during lunch." Gabriel's words were clearly intended as more than casual friendliness, and Amara felt a flutter of something unexpected in her chest. But Professor Blackwood's sharp cough reminded her of her precarious situation. "Thank you," she managed to say to Gabriel, who nodded once before disappearing into the hallway. When they were alone, Professor Blackwood moved to close the door with deliberate precision. The sound of it clicking shut seemed to echo in the suddenly claustrophobic space. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone, "I think we need to establish some ground rules." He walked slowly around his desk, each step calculated to intimidate. "You see, I've been teaching at Westfield Preparatory for 23 years. I've seen scholarship students come and go, and I've noticed a pattern." He paused directly in front of her, his gray eyes boring into hers. "They arrive with a chip on their shoulder, convinced they need to prove something. They disrupt the carefully cultivated atmosphere of academic excellence that our paying families expect." Amara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not here to disrupt anything, Professor. I'm here to learn. Are you? His smile was sharp as a razor. Because what I witnessed today wasn't learning, it was showboating. A desperate attempt to prove you belong in a place where you clearly don't fit. He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Let me make something crystal clear, Miss Johnson. Your scholarship covers tuition, but it doesn't buy you respect. That has to be earned, and frankly, I'm not sure you have what it takes. The cruelty in his words hit Amara like a physical blow, but instead of crumbling, she felt something steel-hard form in her chest. She thought of her grandmother, Nana Rose, who had raised her in a tiny apartment above the corner store she ran with calloused hands and unwavering determination. Nana Rose, who had worked 16-hour days to pay for Amara's SAT prep books and college applications. Nana Rose, who had cried tears of joy when the Westfield acceptance letter arrived, saying, "Baby girl, you're going to places I could never even dream of." Professor Blackwood, Amara said, her voice gaining strength with each word, I didn't earn this scholarship by backing down from challenges. I earned it by outperforming students who had every advantage I didn't. Private tutors, test prep courses, college counselors, I had none of that. What I had was a grandmother who believed in me and a public library that stayed open until 9 o'clock every night. Something flickered in Professor Blackwood's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. But it was gone so quickly that Amara wondered if she had imagined it. How touching, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. A bootstrap story. How very American. He returned to his desk, making a show of arranging his papers. But here's the reality, Miss Johnson. Westfield Preparatory isn't a feel-good movie where the underdog triumphs through sheer determination. This is an institution that prepares the future leaders of America. Students who will attend Harvard, Yale, Princeton, not because they're smart, but because they understand how the world actually works. And how is that, exactly? Amara challenged, her fear transforming into righteous anger. Professor Blackwood looked up from his papers, his expression almost pleased. Through connections. Through understanding your place in the social hierarchy. Through knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. He leaned back in his chair, studying her like a specimen under a microscope. Tell me, Miss Johnson, what do you know about your classmates? The question caught Amara off guard. What do you mean? Gabriel Richardson, for instance. The boy who was so eager to offer his assistance. Professor Blackwood's smile turned predatory. His father is Senator James Richardson, chair of the Senate Education Committee. His mother is Dr. Elena Richardson, one of the most influential neurosurgeons on the East Coast. Gabriel doesn't just attend Westfield. His family's donations built the library where he so graciously offered to meet you. Amara felt her stomach drop. Gabriel's kindness suddenly seemed tainted, another reminder of how different their worlds were. And then there's Madison Crawford, the blonde girl in the third row who was taking notes during your little performance. Her father owns Crawford Industries, you know, the company that manufactures the devices in probably half the hospitals in America. Madison's been groomed since birth to take over a multi-billion-dollar empire. Each name Professor Blackwood mentioned felt like another weight added to Amara's shoulders. She was an outsider in every possible way, economically, socially, culturally. I'm not telling you this to be cruel, Miss Johnson, Professor Blackwood continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm telling you this so you understand the reality of your situation. These students aren't your peers. They're your betters, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. And the sooner you accept that, the easier your time here will be. But instead of crushing Amara's spirit, Professor Blackwood's words had the opposite effect. She thought of her mother, who had died when Amara was 12, leaving behind a daughter and a mountain of medical bills. She thought of the nights she had spent studying by candlelight when the electricity was shut off. She thought of the scholarship essay she had written about overcoming adversity, the one that had apparently impressed the admissions committee enough to offer her a full ride. You know what, Professor? Amara said, her voice steady and clear. You're right about one thing. I don't come from money. I don't have connections. I don't have a trust fund or a family name that opens doors. She stood up, shouldering her worn messenger bag with newfound confidence. But I have something they don't have. I have hunger. I have the absolute certainty that I can't afford to fail. And I have the knowledge that everything I achieve here, I will have earned through my own merit. Professor Blackwood's expression shifted, his confident smirk faltering slightly. So thank you, Amara continued, for reminding me exactly why I'm here. Not to fit in, not to make friends with senators' sons, but to prove that intelligence and determination matter more than bank accounts and bloodlines. She turned to leave, but Professor Blackwood's voice stopped her at the door. Miss Johnson, he called, his tone now carrying a note of genuine challenge rather than mere cruelty. I hope you realize that your little speech has just painted a target on your back. I will be watching every assignment, every test, every class participation. And when you inevitably fail to meet Westfield standards, I will personally ensure that your scholarship is revoked. Amara turned back to face him, her dark eyes blazing with determination. Then I guess you'll be watching me succeed. As she walked into the hallway, her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with adrenaline. She had just declared war on one of the most powerful teachers at Westfield Preparatory, and she knew there would be consequences. But she also knew something else. She had found her purpose here. It wasn't just about getting an education anymore. It was about proving that merit could triumph over privilege, that intelligence could overcome prejudice. What she didn't know was that her confrontation with Professor Blackwood had been overheard by someone who would soon become either her greatest ally or her most dangerous enemy. And in the complex social ecosystem of Westfield Preparatory, the distinction might make all the difference between success and destruction. 3 weeks had passed since Amara's first confrontation with Professor Blackwood, and the temperature in his classroom had dropped to Arctic levels. Every assignment she submitted was scrutinized with a magnifying glass. Every answer she gave was met with dismissive corrections, and every attempt at class participation was either ignored or twisted into evidence of her supposed inadequacy. But Amara had something Professor Blackwood hadn't counted on. She thrived under pressure. Her essays came back covered in red ink, but the criticisms were increasingly petty. Comma splice in paragraph 3, slightly awkward phrasing in the conclusion, citation format inconsistent with Chicago Manual of Style. Never anything substantial, never anything that questioned her actual understanding of the material. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and everyone in the class could see it. What Professor Blackwood couldn't see was that his campaign of academic harassment had gained Amara an unexpected ally. Gabriel Richardson had begun staying after class to walk with her to the library, their conversations flowing from Shakespeare to social justice, from literature to life. He had a way of making her laugh that surprised her, gentle humor that never felt like mockery, intelligent observations that built on her ideas rather than challenging them. He's trying to break you, Gabriel said one afternoon as they sat in the library's rare books section, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that cost more than most people's cars. His voice carried a note of barely contained anger. What he's doing, it's not teaching, it's psychological warfare. Amara looked up from her copy of Jane Eyre, noting how the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows cast colored shadows across Gabriel's face. Why do you care? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Gabriel's expression grew serious. Because what he's doing is wrong. Because you're the most brilliant person in that class, and he knows it. And because... He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. Because I've never met anyone who fights the way you do. It's like watching someone refuse to drown. The intensity in his voice made Amara's heart skip, but before she could respond, Madison Crawford appeared at their table. The blonde girl from Professor Blackwood's class had been watching their growing friendship with what seemed like genuine curiosity, rather than the dismissive hostility Amara had expected. I'm sorry to interrupt, Madison said, her voice carrying a slight tremor, but I need to tell you something. Both of you. She glanced around the library nervously before pulling out a chair. It's about Professor Blackwood. About what he's planning. Amara felt her stomach clench. What do you mean? Madison's hands were shaking as she placed them on the table. My father sits on the board of trustees. Last night, he was on a conference call with other board members, and I overheard. She swallowed hard. Professor Blackwood has requested a formal academic review of your scholarship status, Amara. He's claiming that your work isn't up to Westfield standards and that admitting you is a mistake. The words hit Amara like a physical blow. She had been so focused on excelling in her classes that she hadn't realized Professor Blackwood's harassment was part of a larger strategy. When? Gabriel asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Next Friday, Madison replied. He's scheduled a public demonstration in front of the academic council. He's going to ask you the most difficult questions he can think of, in front of an audience of trustees, administrators, and... She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. And other students. He's calling it an academic showcase to demonstrate Westfield's commitment to rigorous standards. Gabriel's hands curled into fists. He's setting up a public humiliation. He wants to destroy her in front of everyone. It gets worse, Madison continued. I heard him talking to Dr. Hartwell, the head of admissions. He's been documenting every interaction with you, Amara. Building a case that you're disruptive, disrespectful, and academically unprepared. He's going to recommend that your scholarship be revoked and that you be expelled. Amara felt the world tilt around her. Everything she had worked for, everything her grandmother had sacrificed for, everything her mother had dreamed of, it could all disappear in a single afternoon. There's more, Madison said, her voice barely audible. He's been reaching out to other scholarship recipients from previous years. Students who left Westfield. He's trying to establish a pattern of what he calls academic and social maladjustment among diversity admits. The clinical language made Amara's skin crawl. She wasn't a student to Professor Blackwood. She was a case study, a problem to be solved, a mistake to be corrected. Why are you telling me this? Amara asked, studying Madison's face for any sign of deception. Madison's blue eyes filled with tears. Because I've been watching what he's doing to you for weeks, and I know it's wrong. Because my best friend from middle school was a scholarship student at my old school, and I saw how the teachers treated her differently. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And because I heard the questions he's planning to ask you. Amara, they're impossible. He's pulling from graduate-level courses, from obscure literary criticism, from texts that aren't even in our curriculum. He's designed them to make you fail. Gabriel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. We have to do something. We can't let him destroy her like this. What can we do? Amara asked, her voice hollow. He's a tenured professor with 23 years of experience. I'm a scholarship student from the wrong side of town. Who's going to believe me? But even as she spoke the words, Amara felt something familiar stirring in her chest. The same feeling she had experienced when her mother died and everyone assumed she would drop out of school. The same feeling she had felt when her guidance counselor suggested she aim for community college instead of a 4-year university. The same feeling that had carried her through every challenge, every obstacle, every person who had tried to tell her she wasn't good enough. It was rage. Pure, crystalline rage that burned away fear and doubt and left only determination. Madison, she said, her voice gaining strength, I need you to get me a list of those questions. Everything he's planning to ask. Madison's eyes widened. How can I possibly? Your father has access to Professor Blackwood's files through the board. You said he's been documenting everything. That means there's a paper trail, meeting notes, preparation materials. Amara, Gabriel said softly, even if we get the questions, some of them are graduate level. You have 6 days to prepare for material that PhD students struggle with. Amara stood up, her decision crystallizing with each word. Then I guess I know what I'm doing for the next 6 days. She looked at Madison. Can you get me those files? Madison nodded slowly. I think so. But Amara, you need to understand, if you go through with this, if you face him in that public forum, there's no going back. If you fail, he'll use it as proof that the entire scholarship program is flawed. Other students like you won't get the chances you've had. The weight of that responsibility settled on Amara's shoulders like a cloak. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every student who would come after her, every brilliant mind that might be dismissed because of their zip code or their bank account. Then I won't fail, she said simply. Gabriel moved closer to her, his voice intense. You don't have to do this alone. I'll help you prepare. Madison, you too. We can research together, create study guides, practice questions. Madison nodded eagerly. My father's law firm has access to academic databases. I can get you resources that aren't available in the school library. As they began to plan, Amara felt something shift in the air around them. What had started as a personal vendetta had become something larger. It was a coalition, a rebellion, a small group of students who had decided that intelligence and determination mattered more than privilege and prejudice. But what none of them knew was that their whispered conversation in the library's rare books section had not gone unnoticed. A figure had been watching from behind the tall shelves, listening to every word, taking note of every plan. Professor Blackwood had underestimated Amara once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The real war was about to begin. The next 6 days transformed Amara's life into a carefully orchestrated symphony of preparation and paranoia. Madison had managed to access her father's files through a combination of teenage cunning and legitimate research requests, delivering a manila envelope to Amara's locker that contained photocopies of Professor Blackwood's detailed notes. The questions were even worse than Madison had warned. They ranged from obscure Victorian poetry analysis to complex philosophical interpretations of medieval texts. Some required knowledge of French and Latin etymology. Others demanded familiarity with critical theory that wouldn't typically be encountered until graduate school. It was clear that Professor Blackwood had designed each question not to test knowledge, but to expose ignorance. Listen to this one, Gabriel said, his voice incredulous as he read from the list. They were sitting in the Richardson family library, a 2-story room in Gabriel's family estate that contained more books than most public libraries. Discuss the hermeneutic implications of Gadamer's philosophical framework as applied to the liminal spaces in Chrétien de Troyes Arthurian romances, with particular attention to the epistemological tensions between medieval and postmodern interpretative strategies. Amara looked up from the stack of literary criticism she was speed-reading, her eyes burning from hours of concentrated study. I don't even know what half those words mean. That's the point, Madison said from her position on the floor, surrounded by printouts from academic databases. He's not testing your knowledge, he's testing your ability to admit defeat gracefully. The three of them had fallen into a routine over the past 4 days. Every afternoon after school, they would meet at Gabriel's house, where his family's resources, extensive library, high-speed internet, and access to academic journals, gave them the tools they needed. Every evening, Amara would return to her grandmother's small apartment above the corner store, where she would continue studying by the light of a single desk lamp until her eyes could no longer focus. But it wasn't just the academic pressure that was wearing on her. The social dynamics at Westfield had shifted dramatically since word of the upcoming academic showcase had spread through the student body. Some students looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with what appeared to be genuine respect. But underneath it all was an electric tension, the feeling that something momentous was about to happen. You're pushing yourself too hard, Gabriel said, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. When was the last time you slept more than 4 hours? Amara rubbed her temples, trying to ease the headache that had become her constant companion. I can't afford to sleep. Every question on this list represents years of study. I'm trying to compress graduate-level education into less than a week. Maybe that's impossible, Madison said gently. Maybe the point isn't to answer every question perfectly. Maybe the point is to show that you can't be intimidated. Easy for you to say, Amara snapped, then immediately regretted her tone. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Yes, you did, Madison interrupted, her voice steady. And you're right. It is easy for me to say. If I fail spectacularly in front of the Board of Trustees, I'll be embarrassed for a few weeks and then everyone will move on. If you fail, you lose everything. The honesty in Madison's voice cut through Amara's exhaustion. She had been so focused on the academic challenge that she had forgotten about the human cost of her new friendships. Gabriel and Madison were risking their social standing to help her, and she had no right to take that sacrifice lightly. I'm scared, Amara admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Not just of failing, but of what failing means. My grandmother worked 16-hour days to support my education. My mother died believing I would achieve things she never could. If I lose this scholarship, I don't just lose my future, I lose theirs too. Gabriel moved to sit beside her on the couch, his presence warm and steady. You're not going to fail. How can you be so sure? Because I've watched you these past weeks. I've seen how you approach every challenge Professor Blackwood throws at you. You don't just memorize answers. You understand concepts. You don't just repeat what you've read, you synthesize ideas from multiple sources. He paused, his dark eyes intense. And because I've never met anyone who fights the way you do. The words echoed what he had said in the library weeks earlier, but now they carried a different weight. Amara found herself looking at Gabriel, really looking at him, and seeing not just the senator's son who had offered to help, but a young man who had chosen to stand with her when it would have been easier to stay silent. Gabriel, she said softly, why are you doing this? Really? Your family has connections to half the powerful people in Washington. You could have any future you want. Why risk your reputation for someone you barely know? Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the marble fireplace. Because I've spent my entire life watching people succeed or fail based on who their parents are rather than who they are. Because I've seen brilliant minds dismissed because they didn't have the right last name or the right bank account. He turned to face her, his expression serious. And because watching you refuse to be intimidated by Professor Blackwood has been the most inspiring thing I've ever witnessed. The air between them seemed to shimmer with unspoken possibilities. Amara felt her heart race, not from academic anxiety but from something entirely different, a recognition that her feelings for Gabriel had evolved far beyond gratitude or friendship. Madison cleared her throat diplomatically. I hate to interrupt this moment, but we have a problem. She was holding her phone, her face pale. I just got a text from my father. The board meeting has been moved up. Professor Blackwood convinced them to schedule the showcase for tomorrow afternoon instead of Friday. Amara felt the world tilt. Tomorrow? But I'm not ready. I've barely covered half the material. He's trying to catch you off guard, Gabriel said, his voice tight with anger. He knows you're preparing, so he's changing the timeline. How is that even possible? Amara asked, panic rising in her throat. Madison's expression was grim. Professor Blackwood told the board that rumors about the showcase were disrupting the academic environment. He claimed it would be better for everyone if the matter was resolved quickly and quietly. Quietly, Amara repeated, understanding the implication. He wants fewer people to witness what he thinks will be my humiliation. Or, Gabriel said slowly, he wants fewer people to witness what might be his. Amara looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Think about it. If you are actually unprepared, if you are actually the academic fraud he claims you are, why would he need to change the timeline? Why would he need to stack the deck with impossible questions? Gabriel's voice grew stronger as he spoke. He's not just trying to prove you don't belong here. He's trying to prove something to himself. Which is what? That his assumptions about you are correct. That his worldview is justified. That privilege and prejudice are really just natural order disguised as academic standards. Madison nodded slowly. Gabriel's right. Professor Blackwood isn't just attacking you, he's defending an entire system of beliefs. And deep down, I think he knows that system is wrong. Amara felt something shift in her chest. The fear was still there, but it was transforming into something else, determination mixed with clarity. She stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the Richardson family's manicured gardens. "You know what?" she said, turning back to face her friends. "Let him move up the timeline. Let him ask his impossible questions. Let him stack the deck however he wants." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "Because I'm done being afraid of him. I'm done letting him define what I'm capable of." "Amara," Madison said carefully, "you've only had 4 days to prepare. Some of these questions would challenge professors." "Then I guess I'll have to be better than a professor," Amara replied. "At least for one afternoon." Gabriel stood up, moving to stand beside her. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you won't be facing it alone." "Actually," Madison said, a new note in her voice about that, "I may have found a way to even the odds a little bit." Both Amara and Gabriel turned to look at her. Madison's expression had taken on the calculating look that usually preceded her most devious schemes. "What are you thinking?" Gabriel asked. Madison smiled, and for the first time in days, it was a smile of genuine confidence. "I'm thinking that Professor Blackwood isn't the only one who can play games with timing and audience. He wants to humiliate you in front of the board? Fine. But what if the board isn't the only audience?" "Madison," Amara said slowly, "what did you do?" "I may have mentioned to a few people that tomorrow's showcase would be a perfect opportunity to see Westfield's commitment to academic excellence in action. The kind of thing that would interest, say, educational journalists. Or college admission counselors from other schools. Or what?" Gabriel prompted. Madison's smile widened. "Or the documentary crew that's been following Senator Richardson's education reform initiatives. The ones who are very interested in stories about merit versus privilege in elite academic institutions." Gabriel's eyes widened. "Madison, you didn't." "I did. And they'll be there tomorrow, cameras rolling, to document what Professor Blackwood has promised will be a demonstration of Westfield's uncompromising academic standards." Amara felt her heart stop. "You mean?" "I mean that tomorrow's showcase won't be a quiet board meeting. It'll be a public demonstration with national media coverage. Professor Blackwood wanted to destroy you privately. Instead, he's going to have to do it on camera, in front of people who will ask very uncomfortable questions about his methods and motivations." The implications hit Amara like a wave. Tomorrow's confrontation wouldn't just determine her fate at Westfield. It would become a public examination of everything the school claimed to represent. "Madison," she said quietly, "what if I fail? What if I can't answer his questions? Now it won't just be my humiliation, it'll be broadcast to the entire country." Madison's expression grew serious. "Then you'll fail with dignity, and the whole country will see exactly what kind of man Professor Blackwood really is." Gabriel took Amara's hand, his touch warm and steady. "But you're not going to fail. Because you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for every student who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere. And that's a fight worth winning." As they stood there in the soft light of the library, Amara realized that tomorrow would change everything, not just her future, but the future of every student who would come after her. The showcase that was meant to destroy her had become something else entirely, a battle for the soul of education itself. The question was, would she be ready for it? When you've had to face a challenge that felt bigger than yourself, what kept you going? Was it fear, determination, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments, because tomorrow, Amara faces the moment that will define not just her future, but her very identity. The morning of the showcase dawned gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Amara stood in front of her grandmother's cracked bathroom mirror, trying to steady her hands as she adjusted the collar of her best blouse, the one Nana Rose had bought her for high school graduation. It was simple, navy blue, professional without being expensive. It would have to do. "Baby girl," Nana Rose said from the doorway, her weathered hands holding a steaming cup of coffee that smelled like home and safety. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad." Amara managed a weak smile. That's not far from the truth. Her grandmother moved closer, setting the coffee on the small vanity and placing her hands on Amara's shoulders. "Let me tell you something your mama would have told you if she were here. You got something inside you that can't be taught in any fancy school. You got heart, and you got truth, and you got the kind of strength that only comes from knowing what it means to fight for everything you have." "What if it's not enough?" Amara whispered. "Then you'll find more," Nana Rose said simply. "Because that's what we do in this family. We find more." 2 hours later, Amara stood outside the imposing doors of Westfield's main auditorium, her worn messenger bag clutched against her chest like armor. The building was busier than she had ever seen it, with unfamiliar faces moving purposefully through the hallways. She caught glimpses of professional cameras, heard snippets of conversation about educational equity and academic integrity. Madison had been right. This wasn't going to be a quiet board meeting. "Ready?" Gabriel's voice came from behind her. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her grandmother's monthly rent, but his expression was warm and encouraging. "As ready as someone can be for public execution," Amara replied, trying to inject some humor into her voice. "Don't think of it as execution," Madison said, appearing at Gabriel's side. "Think of it as a revolution." The three of them entered the auditorium together, and Amara's breath caught. The space had been transformed into something that looked more like a courtroom than a classroom. At the front, a long table held the board of trustees, their faces arranged in expressions of polite interest. Behind them, tiered seating held what appeared to be faculty members, administrators, and her heart skipped, several people with cameras and notepads. But it was the figure standing at the center of the room that made Amara's blood run cold. Professor Blackwood was dressed in his finest academic regalia, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression radiating confidence. He looked like a man who had already won. "Miss Johnson," he called out, his voice carrying across the auditorium with theatrical precision. "How punctual! Please, take your seat." A single chair had been placed in the center of the room, directly under the brightest lights. It was positioned so that she would be facing not just Professor Blackwood and the board, but the entire audience. Every angle would be visible to the cameras. As Amara walked toward the chair, she noticed something that made her steps falter. In the back row, almost hidden in the shadows, sat a woman she didn't recognize. Elderly, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. The woman was watching Professor Blackwood with an expression of barely concealed disgust. "Ladies and gentlemen," Professor Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "we are here today to conduct what I have termed an academic showcase. The purpose is simple: to demonstrate the rigorous standards that have made Westfield Preparatory Academy a beacon of educational excellence for over a century." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the audience. Miss Johnson represents what some might call an educational experiment. She was admitted to Westfield despite coming from a less rigorous academic background. Today, we will determine whether that experiment has been successful. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and Amara saw several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. One of the documentary filmmakers was already recording, his camera focused on Professor Blackwood's face. "Miss Johnson," Professor Blackwood continued, turning to face her directly, "I will ask you a series of questions that any well-prepared Westfield student should be able to answer. Your responses will be evaluated by the Board of Trustees, who will then make recommendations regarding your continued enrollment." Amara nodded, not trusting her voice. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Let's begin with something simple," Professor Blackwood said, his tone suggesting that nothing about this would be simple. "Please discuss the hermeneutic implications of Gadamer's philosophical framework as applied to the liminal spaces in Chrétien de Troyes Arthurian romances, with particular attention to the epistemological tensions between medieval and postmodern interpretative strategies." The exact question Gabriel had read from the list. Amara felt a moment of relief. At least she had prepared for this one. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she realized something that made her blood run cold. She had prepared for the question, but not for the context. In the privacy of Gabriel's library, discussing complex philosophical concepts had felt like an intellectual exercise. Here, under the harsh lights, with cameras recording every word, it felt like a trap. "Professor Blackwood," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "before I answer that question, I'd like to understand something. What does Hans Georg Gadamer's 20th century philosophical hermeneutics have to do with a high school literature curriculum?" A murmur ran through the audience. Professor Blackwood's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Johnson, you're here to answer questions, not ask them." "Actually," Amara said, finding her footing, "I think questions are exactly what education should be about. And I think the question you've just asked reveals more about your teaching philosophy than my academic preparation." She stood up, her fear transforming into something else, a clarity that came from finally understanding what was really happening. "You see," she continued, addressing not just Professor Blackwood but the entire audience, "the question you've asked isn't designed to test knowledge. It's designed to test whether I can perform academic jargon in a way that sounds impressive but means nothing. It's the kind of question that privileges vocabulary over understanding, intimidation over education." Professor Blackwood's face was beginning to redden. "Miss Johnson, you will answer the question as asked, or what?" Amara interrupted. "You'll prove that I don't belong here?" "Professor, I've spent the last 4 days preparing for this moment, and I've learned something important. I can answer your question. I can discuss Gadamer's hermeneutic circle and its application to medieval literature. I can explain how postmodern interpretative strategies challenge traditional readings of Arthurian romance. I can give you exactly the kind of answer that would impress the board and make me sound like I deserve to be here." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I won't. Because that's not what education is about. Education is about understanding, not performance. It's about asking better questions, not just providing expected answers." The auditorium had gone completely silent. Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer. "You want to know what I learned from studying Chrétien de Troyes?" Amara continued, her voice growing stronger. "I learned that the Arthurian romances are fundamentally about the tension between individual merit and social hierarchy. They're about knights who prove their worth through actions, not birthright. They're about the revolutionary idea that nobility comes from character, not bloodline." She turned to face the board of trustees directly. "And that's exactly what you're afraid of, isn't it, Professor Blackwood? Not that I can't answer your questions, but that I can. Not that I don't belong here, but that I do. You're afraid that if students like me succeed, it proves that intelligence and determination matter more than privilege and connections." Professor Blackwood's composure finally cracked. "Miss Johnson, your presumption is—" "My presumption," Amara said, her voice cutting through his protests, "is that merit matters. My presumption is that a student's potential isn't determined by their parents' bank account. My presumption is that Westfield Preparatory Academy is actually committed to the educational excellence it claims to represent." The elderly woman in the back row was now leaning forward, her eyes bright with interest. Several board members were exchanging glances that suggested they were seeing something they hadn't expected. "But you know what I've really learned these past weeks?" Amara continued. "I've learned that the biggest threat to educational excellence isn't students who ask difficult questions or challenge assumptions. It's teachers who use their authority to intimidate rather than inspire. It's institutions that confuse exclusivity with quality. It's the kind of thinking that says some students are more deserving of opportunities than others based on factors they can't control. She looked directly at Professor Blackwood, and for the first time since entering the auditorium, she felt truly confident. So here's my answer to your question, Professor. Gadamer's hermeneutic framework teaches us that understanding requires genuine dialogue between different perspectives. It requires acknowledging that the interpreter brings their own context to the text. And it requires recognizing that meaning emerges from the interaction between reader and text, not from the imposition of authority. She paused, letting the irony sink in. Which means that your question, and this entire showcase, reveals more about your hermeneutic framework than mine. You're not trying to understand my capabilities. You're trying to impose your preconceptions about what those capabilities should be. The auditorium erupted in murmurs, cameras swiveling to capture the reaction from the audience. Professor Blackwood looked like a man who had just watched his carefully constructed world crumble. But it was the elderly woman in the back row who spoke next, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos. "Brilliant," she said, standing up. "Absolutely brilliant." Every head in the auditorium turned toward her. Professor Blackwood's face went from red to pale as the woman made her way down the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, "allow me to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, Professor Emeritus of Literature at Harvard University, and former president of the Modern Language Association." She paused, letting her credentials sink in. "I'm also the anonymous donor who established the scholarship program that brought Miss Johnson to Westfield." The auditorium fell silent. Professor Blackwood looked like he was about to faint. "I've been watching this display with great interest," Dr. Hartwell continued, "and I must say, it has been profoundly educational. Not because of the questions asked, but because of the courage displayed in answering them." She turned to face Amara directly. "Miss Johnson, you have just demonstrated exactly why I created this scholarship program. Not to bring charity cases to Westfield, but to bring fresh perspectives to an institution that has grown too comfortable with its own assumptions." Then she turned to Professor Blackwood, and her voice grew cold. "Professor Blackwood, in 40 years of academic life, I have never witnessed such a disgraceful abuse of pedagogical authority. You have turned education into intimidation, learning into performance, and scholarship into spectacle. You are a disgrace to the profession." The revelation hit the auditorium like a thunderbolt. The anonymous donor, the person whose generosity had made Amara's education possible, had been watching the entire time. And she had just publicly destroyed Professor Blackwood's credibility in front of cameras that would broadcast her words to the entire country. But as Amara looked around the auditorium, she realized that this moment of triumph might also be the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because Professor Blackwood was not a man who would accept defeat gracefully. And the war for her future at Westfield had just become a very public battle. The disciplinary hearing room felt smaller than a coffin, its mahogany panels seeming to close in around Amara as she sat alone at the defendant's table. 3 weeks had passed since the viral video of her intellectual duel with Professor Blackwood had exploded across social media, transforming her from an unknown scholarship student into a symbol of academic excellence triumphing over prejudice. But now, as she faced the stern expressions of the Westfield Preparatory Board of Directors, that victory felt like a distant memory. "Miss Johnson," intoned Board Chairman Harrison Whitmore III, his voice carrying the weight of generations of privilege, "you stand accused of academic dishonesty, disrespectful conduct toward faculty, and bringing disrepute to this institution." His pale eyes, so similar to Professor Blackwood's, fixed on her with barely concealed disgust. "These are serious charges that could result in your immediate expulsion." Amara's hands trembled in her lap, but she kept her chin raised. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversations of reporters who had somehow gained access to what should have been a private hearing. The story had grown beyond her control. #JusticeForAmara was trending, but so was #Westfield Standards. The school's wealthy donors were threatening to pull funding if she wasn't expelled, while civil rights organizations were calling for investigations into systemic discrimination. "The evidence against you is substantial," continued board member Patricia Vanderberg, sliding a thick folder across the polished table. "Professor Blackwood has provided testimony that you've been disruptive in class, that you've encouraged other students to question established curriculum, and most seriously, that you've been accessing restricted academic databases to gain unfair advantages." Amara's heart stopped. "That's not true. I've never." "Furthermore," interrupted another board member, "we have evidence of your communications with outside agitators who have been using your situation to attack this institution's reputation." He held up printouts of text messages and social media posts. "Messages that show you've been coordinating with groups intent on destroying Westfield's academic integrity." The room spun around Amara. She recognized some of the messages. They were from journalists and activists who had reached out to her, but the context had been twisted, edited to make her appear as the instigator rather than someone simply responding to media inquiries. "I never coordinated anything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just answered questions when people asked about what happened in class." "Lies," Professor Blackwood's voice cut through the air like a blade. He had been sitting silently in the corner, but now he stood, his silver hair catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. "From the moment this student arrived at Westfield, she has been determined to undermine our academic standards. She has used her background as a weapon, claiming discrimination whenever her work doesn't meet our expectations." Amara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. In the 3 weeks since their first confrontation, Professor Blackwood had systematically dismantled her academic reputation. He had questioned every essay she submitted, demanded additional citations for points that other students made without challenge, and most devastatingly, he had begun circulating whispers that her scholarship application might have contained exaggerated achievements. "Where is your legal representation, Miss Johnson?" asked Chairman Whitmore, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. I can't afford a lawyer," Amara admitted, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Her mother had worked double shifts at the hospital for weeks, trying to scrape together money for legal fees, but even the cheapest attorney they'd consulted had quoted fees that exceeded their entire annual savings. "How convenient," murmured someone from the board, and Amara felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a stereotype, the poor student who couldn't navigate the system, who didn't belong in their rarefied world. But what hurt most was the empty chair beside her, where Ethan should have been sitting. Ethan Morrison, the boy with kind brown eyes who had become her anchor in the storm of the past 3 weeks. The one person at Westfield who had seen beyond her scholarship status, who had studied with her in the library, who had held her hand when the pressure became overwhelming, who had whispered promises that they would face this together. Until yesterday, when everything had changed. "There's something else," Chairman Whitmore said, his voice taking on a tone that made Amara's blood run cold. "We've received information about your personal relationships at this school. Relationships that may have influenced your academic performance and created conflicts of interest." A new folder appeared on the table, and Amara's heart shattered as she saw photographs of herself and Ethan, studying together, walking across campus, sharing a quiet moment in the library. But these weren't innocent academic collaborations. The photos had been taken from angles that made their relationship appear improper, inappropriate, scandalous. "It appears," continued the chairman, "that you've been involved in an inappropriate relationship with Ethan Morrison, whose family, I should mention, has been a major donor to this institution for 3 generations. Young Morrison has been persuaded to clarify the nature of your relationship." The door opened, and Ethan walked in, his face pale and his eyes refusing to meet hers. He looked like a stranger. Gone was the warm, confident boy who had made her laugh during their study sessions, who had defended her when other students whispered behind her back. In his place stood someone who looked beaten down, defeated. "Mr. Morrison," Chairman Whitmore's voice was suddenly gentle, paternal. "Please tell us about your relationship with Miss Johnson." Ethan's hands shook as he approached the witness table. We He finally looked at Amara, and she saw something break in his eyes. We were just study partners. Nothing more. I was trying to help her adjust to Westfield's academic standards, but she became demanding. Possessive. She threatened to claim I was discriminating against her if I didn't continue helping her with her assignments. The words hit Amara like physical blows. She stood up so quickly that her chair toppled backward. Ethan, no. That's not what happened. You know. Sit down, Miss Johnson, ordered Chairman Whitmore. Mr. Morrison, continue. She used our friendship to gain access to previous year's exams, to assignment examples from other students. Ethan's voice was barely audible, but each word cut deeper than the last. When I tried to distance myself, she said she would claim I was only helping her because I felt sorry for her background. She said she would make it a racial issue. Amara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This was worse than any academic challenge, worse than any humiliation Professor Blackwood could devise. This was betrayal from the person she had trusted most, the person she had allowed herself to care about, the person who had made her believe that maybe she could find love and acceptance in this hostile environment. No, she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. She could see the relief in Ethan's face as he delivered his testimony, and could see how easily he had chosen his family's standing over her truth. How easily he had chosen his world over hers. Furthermore, Professor Blackwood added, his voice dripping with satisfaction, I have evidence that Miss Johnson has been struggling academically far more than she's admitted. Her essay submissions have been declining in quality, her class participation has become increasingly desperate, and several of her recent assignments show signs of possible plagiarism. The room began to spin. Amara gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. They had been building a case against her from the moment she had challenged Professor Blackwood's authority. Every interaction had been documented, every stumble magnified, every moment of vulnerability turned into evidence of her unworthiness. Based on this evidence, Chairman Whitmore announced, this board has no choice but to recommend immediate expulsion from Westfield Preparatory Academy. Miss Johnson, you have brought shame to this institution and betrayed the trust placed in you as a scholarship recipient. The words echoed in the suddenly silent room. Amara felt herself fragmenting, all her dreams of academic success, of proving her worth, of building a future that would make her mother proud, crumbling into dust. She thought of her mother, working those double shifts, sacrificing everything for her daughter's education. She thought of her younger brother, who looked up to her as proof that they could rise above their circumstances. You have 24 hours to clean out your dormitory and leave campus, the chairman continued. Security will escort you to ensure a smooth transition. As the board members filed out, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her future, Amara finally allowed the tears to fall. She had fought so hard, had proven herself academically, had stood up to prejudice and discrimination. But in the end, the system had found a way to crush her anyway. Ethan lingered by the door, his face twisted with what might have been regret. Amara, Don't, she said, her voice hollow. Just don't. He left without another word, and Amara sat alone in the empty hearing room, surrounded by the mahogany panels and crystal chandeliers that had once seemed so impressive. Now they felt like the walls of a tomb, a monument to her failure. Outside, she could hear the protesters chanting her name, demanding justice. But inside this room, justice felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She was just a scholarship student from the wrong side of town, and she had forgotten her place. The darkest hour had arrived, and Amara Johnson had never felt more alone. The rain hammered against the windows of the small coffee shop 3 blocks from Westfield Preparatory, where Amara sat hunched over a lukewarm cup of tea she couldn't afford. Her dormitory room had been emptied, her belongings crammed into 2 worn suitcases and a cardboard box that now sat beside her table like monuments to her failure. In 6 hours, she would board a Greyhound bus back to her old neighborhood, back to Lincoln High School if they would even take her back to a life that suddenly felt like a prison. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, Messages of support from strangers, interview requests from journalists, and most painfully, concerned texts from her mother that she couldn't bring herself to answer. How could she explain that she had lost everything? That the daughter who was supposed to be their family's salvation had been crushed by the very system she had tried to conquer? The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and Amara looked up to see a woman entering, tall, elegant, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple black coat that somehow managed to look both expensive and understated, and she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. Amara Johnson. The woman's voice was warm but authoritative. "I'm Dr. Vivian Hayes. I believe we need to talk." Amara's heart sank. Another reporter, probably, or perhaps someone from the school board coming to ensure she understood the terms of her expulsion. "I'm sorry, but I'm not giving any more interviews. I just want to go home." "I'm not a reporter," Dr. Hayes said, sliding into the chair across from her without invitation. "I'm a professor of constitutional law at Howard University, and more importantly, I'm an alumna of Westfield Preparatory Academy, class of 1978. That got Amara's attention. She studied the woman's face, noting the subtle strength in her features, the way she carried herself with unshakable dignity. "You went to Westfield?" "I was the first black student they ever admitted," Dr. Hayes replied, her voice carrying the weight of history. "And 47 years later, I'm still fighting the same battles you fought in that classroom 3 weeks ago." Amara felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in days: hope. "How did you know about what really happened in that hearing room?" Dr. Hayes reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Because I've been investigating Westfield's practices for the past 5 years. What happened to you isn't an isolated incident, Amara. It's part of a systematic pattern of discrimination that the school has been covering up for decades." The folder hit the table with a satisfying thud, and Amara could see it was filled with documents, photographs, and what looked like legal correspondence. "I don't understand." "Let me explain," Dr. Hayes said, her eyes flashing with the kind of righteous anger that could move mountains. 3 years ago, a brilliant Latino student named Carlos Mendez was expelled from Westfield under similar circumstances. 2 years before that, it was Aisha Patel, a Pakistani-American girl whose parents had sacrificed everything to send her there. The pattern is always the same: outstanding academic performance initially, then sudden behavioral issues, followed by expulsion just before graduation. Amara's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The documents inside told a story that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Student after student, all from underrepresented backgrounds, all scholarship recipients, all dismissed from Westfield just before they could claim their diplomas and prove that merit could triumph over privilege. But why? Amara whispered. Why would they do this? "Because," Dr. Hayes said, leaning forward with intensity, "Westfield Preparatory has been engaged in a careful balancing act for decades. They accept just enough minority students to maintain their federal funding and avoid discrimination lawsuits, but they ensure that most of those students don't actually graduate. It protects their image as an elite institution while maintaining the status quo." The revelation hit Amara like a physical blow. She thought of Professor Blackwood's calculated cruelty, of the way the board had so easily accepted fabricated evidence, of how quickly Ethan had been turned against her. It hadn't been personal, it had been systematic. The evidence tampering, the coordinated testimony, the sudden appearance of academic integrity issues, it's all part of a playbook they've been using for years, Dr. Hayes continued. And they're very good at it. Most students just disappear quietly, too ashamed or too beaten down to fight back. "But you said you graduated," Amara said, grasping for understanding. "How did you survive?" Dr. Hayes smiled, and for the first time, Amara saw warmth break through her professional demeanor. "I survived because I had something you don't know you have yet. I had proof. And more importantly, I had allies." She pulled out her phone and showed Amara a photograph, a group of successful-looking adults standing together at what appeared to be a reunion. These are the other survivors, Amara. The ones who made it through Westfield's gauntlet and went on to become judges, doctors, senators, CEOs. We call ourselves the Phoenix Society, and we've been waiting for the right moment to take down this corrupt system. Amara stared at the photo, recognizing some of the faces from news programs and magazine covers. You're saying there are others who went through this? Not just others, Dr. Hayes said, her voice taking on a tone that made Amara's spine straighten. There are dozens of us, and we've been building a legal case for years. We have financial records showing how the school manipulates its diversity statistics, internal communications discussing the scholarship student problem, and most damning of all, we have a whistleblower. The coffee shop door chimed again, and Amara looked up to see a young man entering, tall, with familiar kind brown eyes that were now filled with determination rather than the defeat she had last seen in them. Her heart stopped. "Ethan," she whispered. He approached their table hesitantly, his face pale but resolute. "Amara, I need to apologize. And I need to tell you the truth." Dr. Hayes gestured for him to sit, and Amara noticed that there was no surprise in her expression. "You knew he was coming," she said. "Ethan contacted me yesterday," Dr. Hayes explained. "He's been carrying around a secret that could change everything." Ethan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. "They made me lie in that hearing room. My father, he threatened to disown me, to cut off my college funding, to destroy my future if I didn't testify against you. But I recorded everything, Amara. Every conversation, every threat, every moment when they thought I was complying with their plan." He placed the phone on the table, and Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. What Ethan captured is evidence of witness tampering, conspiracy, and corruption at the highest levels of the school administration. Combined with our other evidence, it's enough to bring down the entire system. Amara felt something shifting inside her chest, not just hope, but something fiercer. Something that felt like power. "You're saying we can fight back?" "We're saying we can win," Dr. Hayes corrected. "But it won't be easy. It will mean going public, facing more scrutiny, reliving the trauma of the past few weeks. And it will mean trusting people again, including people who have let you down." She looked meaningfully at Ethan, who had tears in his eyes. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said to Amara. "What I did was cowardly and wrong. But I want to make it right. I want to help you destroy the system that tried to destroy you." Amara studied his face, seeing the genuine remorse there, the determination that reminded her of the boy she had fallen for in the library. The betrayal still hurt, but she could also see the impossible position he had been placed in, a teenager forced to choose between his family's approval and doing what was right. "There's something else," Dr. Hayes said, pulling out another document. "I've been in contact with the State Attorney General's office. They're very interested in our evidence, particularly the financial fraud aspects. If we move forward with this, it won't just be about getting you reinstated, Amara. It will be about ensuring that no other student ever has to face what you faced." The weight of the moment settled over them. Amara thought of Carlos Mendez, of Aisha Patel, of all the students who had been crushed by this system before her. She thought of her mother, working those double shifts, believing in her daughter's potential. She thought of her younger brother, who needed to see that fighting injustice was possible. "What do you need me to do?" Amara asked, her voice steady for the first time in days. Dr. Hayes smiled, an expression that was both predatory and protective. "I need you to be brave, Amara. I need you to stand up one more time, not just for yourself, but for every student who comes after you. Can you do that?" Amara looked at the evidence spread across the table, at Ethan's hopeful face, at Dr. Hayes's confident expression. She thought of Professor Blackwood's smug certainty, of Chairman Whitmore's dismissive arrogance, of the system that had tried to break her spirit. "Yes," she said, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. "Let's bring them down." Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. The darkest hour was ending, and Amara Johnson was about to discover just how powerful she could be when she had the right allies at her side. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you weren't alone in your struggle? When the right person appeared at exactly the right time to help you fight back. Share your story in the comments, because Amara's about to show us what happens when the underdog gets the support they need to win. The Westfield Preparatory Academy Auditorium had never hosted anything quite like this. 6 weeks after Amara's expulsion, the grand space with its vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers buzzed with an energy that felt more like a courtroom than a school assembly. Television cameras lined the walls, reporters filled the back rows, and the ornate wooden benches that usually held bored students now accommodated a mixture of current pupils, alumni, parents, and civil rights activists. Amara sat in the front row beside Dr. Hayes, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. She wore a simple black dress that her mother had insisted on buying. "You're going to look like the scholar you are," her mother had said, adjusting Amara's collar with tears in her eyes. Behind them, the Phoenix Society members had assembled like a legal army, their presence transforming the space into something that felt both sacred and dangerous. At the podium, State Attorney General Patricia Morrison, no relation to Ethan, despite sharing a surname, shuffled through her notes with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who knew she held a winning hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily through the hushed auditorium, "we are here today to address one of the most systematic and deliberate cases of educational discrimination the state has ever documented." Professor Blackwood sat in the faculty section, his usually immaculate appearance showing cracks, his tie slightly askew, his silver hair less perfectly styled than usual. Beside him, Chairman Whitmore stared straight ahead with the rigid posture of a man trying to maintain dignity in the face of inevitable defeat. "Over the past 6 weeks," Attorney General Morrison continued, "our investigation has uncovered a pattern of discrimination spanning nearly 2 decades. What we discovered was not merely the actions of a few biased individuals, but a coordinated system designed to maintain artificial barriers to academic achievement." The large screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a spreadsheet that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "These are Westfield Preparatory's graduation statistics, broken down by ethnicity and socio-economic status. Notice anything interesting?" A murmur ran through the audience as the numbers told their story. White students from wealthy families graduated at a rate of 97%. Students of color on scholarship graduated at a rate of 23%. The disparity was so stark, so mathematically impossible without deliberate interference, that even the most cynical observers seemed shocked. "But statistics alone don't tell the whole story," Morrison said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "What tells the story is evidence. Evidence of fabricated disciplinary records, manipulated academic evaluations, and most damning of all, recorded conversations planning the systematic removal of minority students." She nodded to her assistant, who pressed a button on the audio system. The auditorium filled with Professor Blackwood's voice, crystal clear and unmistakably his. "The scholarship students are becoming too comfortable, too confident. We need to remind them of their place before they start thinking they actually belong here." Another voice joined the conversation, Chairman Whitmore's patrician tones carrying easily through the speakers. "The Johnson girl is particularly problematic. She's making our other students question the natural order. Perhaps it's time for another academic integrity investigation." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Blackwood's face had gone ashen, while Chairman Whitmore looked like he might be physically ill. Around the auditorium, students and faculty stared at the men they had trusted with their education, seeing them clearly for the first time. "These recordings," Morrison continued, "were made by a member of the school's own community. Someone who had the courage to document the conspiracy happening right under everyone's noses." Ethan stood up from his seat in the student section, his face pale but determined. The auditorium erupted in whispers as he made his way to the witness stand that had been set up for the hearing. Some of the whispers were supportive, students who had suspected something was wrong, but others were clearly hostile, coming from classmates who saw him as a traitor to his own social class. "Mr. Morrison," Attorney General Morrison said formally. "Please tell us how you came to record these conversations." Ethan's voice was steady, though Amara could see his hands trembling slightly. "I started recording after I noticed that several of my study group partners, all scholarship students, had been having unusual disciplinary problems. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. But when my father approached me about testifying against Amara, I realized something much bigger was happening." He pulled out his phone, the same device that had captured the evidence now reverberating through the auditorium. "My father thought I was complying with the plan, so he started including me in meetings with Professor Blackwood and other board members. I recorded everything." The next audio clip was even more damning, a conversation between Ethan's father and Professor Blackwood discussing how to handle the scholarship students. "We can't be too obvious about it. We need to make it look like academic failure or behavioral problems. The key is to break them down gradually, make them doubt themselves until they either leave voluntarily or give us grounds for expulsion." Amara felt a surge of vindication so powerful it was almost overwhelming. Every self-doubt she had experienced, every moment when she had wondered if she was really good enough, every night she had stayed awake questioning her own abilities, it had all been manufactured. The system had been designed to make her feel exactly that way. But perhaps, Attorney General Morrison said, the most revealing evidence comes from the school's own internal communications. The screen changed to show a series of emails, with key phrases highlighted in red. These messages, sent between faculty members and administrators, show a deliberate pattern of targeting high-achieving minority students. One email from Professor Blackwood to the Dean of Students was particularly damning. "The Johnson girl is performing too well. Her success is starting to inspire other scholarship students to become uppity. We need to find a way to bring her down before she becomes a problem we can't contain." Another email from Chairman Whitmore to the board's executive committee was even more explicit. "Our donors are becoming concerned about the changing face of Westfield. We need to ensure that our diversity initiatives don't actually result in diversity among our graduates." The auditorium had fallen completely silent except for the soft clicking of cameras and the scratch of reporters' pens. Even the students seemed to understand that they were witnessing something historic, the moment when a system of oppression was finally exposed to the light. "The evidence is overwhelming," Morrison continued. "But what makes this case truly extraordinary is not just the scope of the conspiracy, but the courage of those who stood up to expose it." She gestured to Amara, who stood and walked to the podium with her head held high. The girl who had entered Westfield 6 weeks ago as a nervous scholarship student had been transformed by fire into something harder, more determined, more powerful. "Miss Johnson," Morrison said, "you have been offered a full reinstatement to Westfield Preparatory, with a guarantee of no retaliation and a formal apology from the administration. Do you accept these terms?" Amara looked out at the assembled crowd, at her mother, who had taken time off work she couldn't afford to be here, at her younger brother who was staring at her with awe, at the Phoenix Society members, who had shown her that she was part of something larger than herself, at Ethan, whose betrayal had nearly broken her but whose courage had ultimately saved her. Then she looked at Professor Blackwood, who was studiously avoiding her gaze, and at Chairman Whitmore, who looked like he had aged a decade in the past hour. "I appreciate the offer," Amara said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without amplification. "But I decline." The silence was so complete that she could hear the tick of the antique clock on the wall. Morrison raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this response. "Instead," Amara continued, "I would like to propose something different. I want Westfield Preparatory to establish a full scholarship program for underrepresented students, not just tuition, but housing, books, meals, and academic support. I want the school to hire diverse faculty members who can serve as mentors and role models. And I want every student who was wrongfully expelled over the past 20 years to be offered the chance to return and complete their education." The auditorium erupted in applause, but Amara wasn't finished. "Most importantly, I want Professor Blackwood and Chairman Whitmore to resign immediately, and I want the school to establish an independent oversight committee to ensure that this never happens again." She turned to look directly at Professor Blackwood, who was finally meeting her gaze. "You tried to break me because you were afraid of what I represented. You were afraid that if I succeeded, it would prove that excellence isn't limited by race or class or background. Well, Professor Blackwood, I'm still here. And I'm not the only one." Attorney General Morrison smiled broadly. "The state is prepared to ensure that all of Miss Johnson's conditions are met. In fact, we're prepared to go further. Based on our investigation, we are filing criminal charges against Professor Blackwood and Chairman Whitmore for conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations." The auditorium exploded into chaos. Reporters surged forward, photographers' flashes lit up the room like lightning, and students either cheered or sat in stunned silence. Security officers moved toward the faculty section, where Professor Blackwood and Chairman Whitmore sat frozen in their seats. But Amara wasn't watching the arrests or the media frenzy. She was looking at Ethan, who had made his way through the crowd to reach her. His face was streaked with tears, but he was smiling. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I'm sorry I didn't believe in us enough to stand with you from the beginning." Amara studied his face, seeing the boy she had fallen for in the library, the one who had made her believe that love could cross social boundaries. The betrayal still hurt, but she could also see the man he was becoming, someone who had found the courage to do what was right, even when it cost him everything. "We all make mistakes," she said, extending her hand to him. "The question is what we do next." He took her hand, and she felt something click into place, not just their relationship, but her understanding of her own power. She had walked into Westfield Preparatory Academy as a scholarship student hoping to prove herself worthy of her place. She was leaving as a young woman who had proven that the system itself was unworthy of her. As the chaos continued around them, Dr. Hayes appeared at Amara's side. "So," she said with a grin, "ready to change the world?" Amara looked around the auditorium, at the students who would now attend a better school, at the faculty who would have to confront their own biases, at the system that would be forever changed by what had happened here today. "I think," she said, "I already have." 5 years later. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Harvard Law School classroom as Amara Johnson Morrison gathered her notes from the podium. Her students, a diverse group of first-year law students from backgrounds that would have been unimaginable at Westfield just a few years ago, were filing out with animated conversations about constitutional law and civil rights precedents. "Professor Johnson Morrison," called out Marcus, a young man from Detroit whose scholarship had been funded by the Westfield Justice Foundation, "your lecture on institutional discrimination was incredible. I can't believe you lived through something like that." Amara smiled, adjusting the simple gold wedding band on her finger. "Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most difficult experiences, Marcus. But remember, the story doesn't end with surviving injustice. It ends with transforming the system so others don't have to survive it." As the last student left, Amara packed her materials into the same worn leather messenger bag she had carried into Westfield 5 years ago. It was a deliberate choice, a reminder of how far she had come and how important it was to never forget where she started. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Just finished my surgery. Meet you at the celebration in an hour? Can't wait to see the new building." She smiled, remembering the shy boy who had been terrified of disappointing his family. Dr. Ethan Morrison had become one of Boston's most respected pediatric surgeons, but more importantly, he had become a man who used his privilege to lift others up rather than keep them down. Their wedding 2 years ago had been a small ceremony, but the guest list had read like a who's who of social justice advocates, scholarship recipients, and Phoenix Society members. The drive to Westfield Preparatory Academy took her through familiar neighborhoods, but everything felt different now. The school that had once seemed so imposing, so untouchable, now looked like what it had always been. Just a building, filled with people who were capable of both great cruelty and great change. The campus was buzzing with activity as she parked her car. Students from dozens of different backgrounds moved across the grounds with the confidence that came from knowing they truly belonged. The diversity wasn't just visual. She could hear conversations in multiple languages, see students from rural farms talking with kids from urban centers, watch as academic excellence flourished without the artificial barriers that had once defined this place. Amara. Dr. Hayes's voice carried across the courtyard. At 73, she moved with the same purposeful energy that had characterized their first meeting in that coffee shop. Are you ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be, Amara replied, embracing the woman who had become both mentor and mother figure. How many people are we expecting? Over 300, Dr. Hayes said with satisfaction. Scholarship recipients, current students, faculty, and about 50 media representatives. The Phoenix Society has grown beyond our wildest dreams. They walked together toward the new building that was about to be dedicated, a stunning modern structure that stood in deliberate contrast to the traditional architecture of the rest of the campus. The glass and steel design was open, transparent, welcoming, everything the old Westfield had refused to be. The Amara Johnson Center for Educational Justice, Dr. Hayes read from the brass plaque beside the entrance. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Amara shook her head, still somewhat overwhelmed by the honor. I still can't believe they named it after me. There were so many students who came before. Who paved the way for you, yes, Dr. Hayes interrupted gently. But you were the one who had the courage to fight back publicly, to turn your pain into power. That's why your name is on this building, Amara. Because you didn't just survive, you transformed. Inside the new center, the scene was extraordinary. The main hall was filled with faces that represented every conceivable background. Former scholarship students who had gone on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, activists, and entrepreneurs. Current students mingled with alumni, sharing stories and making connections that would last lifetimes. Near the center of the room, Amara spotted a familiar figure, Professor Sarah Chun, the new dean of students, who had replaced the entire administrative structure that had been dismantled after the scandal. Professor Chun had been Dr. Hayes' student at Howard, and she had brought both academic excellence and genuine commitment to educational justice to her role at Westfield. Amara. Professor Chun approached with a warm smile. I have someone I want you to meet. She gestured to a young Latina girl who couldn't have been more than 14, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of nervous energy that Amara recognized immediately. This is Sofia Martinez. She's starting here next year as part of our new early admission program for exceptional students from underserved communities. Sofia's handshake was firm, but Amara could see the same mixture of excitement and terror that she had felt 5 years ago. It's an honor to meet you, Professor Johnson Morrison. I've read everything about your case. It's because of you that I can be here. It's because of you that you're here, Amara corrected gently. Your intelligence, your hard work, your determination, those are the things that earned you this opportunity. What I did was just help remove some of the barriers that should never have existed in the first place. Sofia's eyes lit up. Professor Chun told me you're still working on cases like yours. Is that true? It is, Amara confirmed. The Johnson Morrison Foundation has handled over 200 cases of educational discrimination in the past 5 years. We've helped reform policies at 63 schools and universities across the country. And, added a new voice, we're just getting started. Amara turned to see Ethan approaching, still in his hospital scrubs but smiling broadly. He had driven straight from surgery to be here, and the sight of him filled her with the same warmth she had felt in the Westfield Library all those years ago. Dr. Morrison, Sofia said respectfully, I heard you were the one who recorded all the evidence. That was really brave. Ethan glanced at Amara, his expression growing serious. I wasn't brave at first, Sofia. I let fear and family pressure make me do something I knew was wrong. But I learned that real courage isn't about never being afraid, it's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. That's a lesson we all had to learn, said another familiar voice. Carlos Mendez, the former Westfield student whose case had been one of the first Dr. Hayes had investigated, approached with his wife and 2 young children. Now a successful engineer, He served on the board of the Johnson Morrison Foundation. Fear is a powerful weapon when it's used against us. But it becomes our strength when we learn to overcome it. As the afternoon progressed, Amara found herself moving through the crowd, listening to stories that both broke her heart and filled her with hope. She met Maria Santos, a former scholarship student who had become a federal judge, James Washington, who had turned his wrongful expulsion into motivation to become a civil rights attorney, and dozens of others who had transformed their pain into purpose. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when she encountered an unexpected visitor, a man in his 60s with silver hair and tired eyes, standing quietly in a corner of the reception hall. "Professor Blackwood," she said, her voice carefully neutral. He looked up, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before, genuine humility. "Miss Johnson. I wasn't sure if I should come today." "But you did come," she observed. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the bustling room filled with successful young people whose potential he had once tried to destroy. "Because I needed to see what I had tried to prevent. I needed to understand what I had almost destroyed." "And what do you see?" "I see," he said slowly, "that I was wrong about everything. I see young people who are not threats to excellence, but examples of it. I see that diversity doesn't lower standards, it raises them." He paused, his voice growing softer. "I see that I spent my career trying to preserve a system that was already broken, when I should have been working to fix it." Amara studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there. "What are you doing now?" "I'm teaching at a community college," he said. "Remedial English and basic writing skills. It's humbling work. But it's also rewarding in ways I never expected." He looked at her directly. "I'm trying to spend the rest of my career helping students succeed instead of finding ways to make them fail." "That's all any of us can do," Amara said. "Learn from our mistakes and try to do better." As the dedication ceremony began, Amara found herself standing at the podium in the same auditorium where her life had been transformed 5 years earlier. The room was packed with faces that reflected the full spectrum of human potential, exactly what education should look like. "5 years ago," she began, "I walked into this institution as a scholarship student who just wanted to prove she belonged. I walked out as a young woman who had learned that the question was never whether I belonged. The question was whether this institution was worthy of me." The applause was thunderous, but Amara held up a hand for quiet. "Today, I can say with confidence that Westfield Preparatory Academy has become worthy of every student who walks through its doors. Not because the buildings are newer or the programs are better, but because it has finally embraced the truth that excellence comes in every color, every background, every zip code." She looked out at the crowd, seeing Sophia Martinez in the front row, taking notes with the same intensity that Amara had brought to her studies. Seeing Ethan, whose love had given her the strength to rebuild after betrayal. Seeing Dr. Hayes, whose wisdom had shown her that her struggle was part of a larger movement for justice. "The Amara Johnson Center for Educational Justice isn't just a building," she continued. "It's a promise. A promise that every student who enters this institution will be judged not by their background, but by their potential. Not by their family's bank account, but by their own hard work. Not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." As the crowd rose in a standing ovation, Amara felt a profound sense of completion. She had walked into Westfield Preparatory Academy as a girl seeking acceptance. She was leaving as a woman who had learned that the most important acceptance was the one she gave herself. Later, as the sun set over the campus, Amara and Ethan walked hand in hand toward their car. The new building glowed in the evening light, its transparent walls a symbol of the openness and honesty that now characterized the institution. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked quietly. Amara considered the question seriously. "About the pain? About the betrayal? About the nights I stayed awake wondering if I was strong enough to fight?" She squeezed his hand. "No. Because all of that led us here. Led us to each other, to this work, to the chance to make sure other students never have to face what I faced." "And our future?" he asked. "Are you ready for the next challenge?" She smiled, thinking of the letter in her briefcase, an invitation to argue a case before the Supreme Court, a case that could establish new precedents for educational equity across the entire nation. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." As they drove away from Westfield Preparatory Academy, Amara looked back one last time at the institution that had tried to break her and had instead forged her into something stronger. The girl who had walked through those doors 5 years ago had been seeking permission to belong. The woman who drove away that evening had learned that she didn't need anyone's permission to be extraordinary. The future stretched ahead of them, full of new challenges and opportunities to fight for justice. But for the first time in her life, Amara Johnson Morrison felt truly at peace. She had not just survived, she had triumphed. And in doing so, she had opened doors for countless others to follow. What dreams are you fighting for? What barriers are you working to overcome? Share your story in the comments, because like Amara, you have the power to transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone who comes after you.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.